First story by Johnathan Harker. It was a winter like no other in the small town of Aspen, Colorado. The year was 2019, and I, Johnathan Harker, had decided to spend the winter in my family's old isolated house nestled in the outskirts of town. The house, a 2-story Victorian-era building, had been in our family for generations, but had stood empty for years. Seeking solitude and a break from city life, I thought it would be the perfect retreat. My first few days were peaceful, filled with reading and enjoying the serene, snow-covered landscape. But as the nights grew longer and the winter chill deepened, I started feeling uneasy. It began with small, almost negligible things. A creaking floorboard, a flickering light, a feeling of being watched. I brushed these off as products of the old house and my overactive imagination. One night, as the wind howled outside and the snowstorm intensified, I was awakened by a faint whispering sound. It seemed to come from downstairs. Thinking it might be the wind or perhaps some animal that had found its way in, I decided to investigate. As I descended the stairs, the whispering grew louder, more distinct, but still unintelligible. The living room was in disarray. Books had fallen from the shelves, and the curtains billowed as if caught in a gust of wind, despite all the windows being firmly shut. The whispering stopped abruptly, leaving behind a suffocating silence. I felt a cold draft that seemed out of place, even in the dead of winter. Chilled to the bone, and with my heart pounding, I decided to check the rest of the house. Every room was as cold as ice, and my breath fogged in the air. But there was nothing, no source for the strange occurrences. Returning to my bedroom, I tried to convince myself it was all just a nightmare, but sleep eluded me. As the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, I noticed something that chilled me to my core. On the frost-covered window, there were handprints on the outside pane, too large to be human, and too distinct to be a trick of the light. The rest of my stay was marked by an unshakable feeling of dread. Objects would move on their own. Shadows seemed to play tricks in the corners of my eyes, and the whispering would return every night, always indecipherable, always leaving behind an icy coldness. Finally, I couldn't take it anymore. I packed my bags and left the house, vowing never to return. The locals spoke of the house having a troubled past, but I never believed in such tales. Now, I'm not so sure. Was it the house, the harsh winter, or something else? I still don't have the answers, but one thing is certain. That winter changed me, and the whispers in the cold still haunt my dreams. That story was bone-chilling, wasn't it? But brace yourself, because this next tale is even more terrifying. Make sure you're in a cozy spot. This one will send shivers down your spine. Second story by Emily Carter. In the winter of 2021, my friends and I planned a weekend getaway to a cabin in the Rocky Mountains. The cabin, belonging to my friend Laura's family, was perched on a remote hillside, offering stunning views and complete isolation. It sounded like a perfect escape from our busy lives in Denver, Colorado. The first day was everything we had hoped for. We spent it exploring the snow-covered woods and enjoying the cozy cabin. As night fell, we gathered around the fireplace, sharing stories and laughter. But as the hours ticked by, the mood began to shift. That night, I was jolted awake by a sound outside, a crunching noise like footsteps in the snow. Peering out the window, I saw nothing but the moonlit forest. Thinking I had imagined it, I tried to go back to sleep, but then Laura whispered from across the room, "Did you hear that too?" We sat in silence, listening. The footsteps continued, circling the cabin, methodical and persistent. Frightened, we woke the others. Our friend Mark suggested it might be an animal, but the footsteps seemed too heavy, too deliberate. We decided to stay inside and wait for morning, but sleep was impossible. The footsteps stopped, but the feeling of being watched did not. In the morning, we ventured outside. To our horror, we found footprints in the snow, large, human-like, but with an odd, elongated shape. They circled the cabin several times before disappearing into the woods. There were no other cabins for miles. Who or what could be out here with us? We debated leaving, but were reluctant to end our trip so abruptly. As the day progressed, unease lingered. Shadows seemed to move in the corner of our eyes, and the forest felt oppressive, watching, waiting. That evening, the feeling of dread intensified. We heard strange noises, whispers in the wind, a faint tapping on the windows. We huddled together, feeling vulnerable in our isolation. Suddenly, the power went out, plunging us into darkness. Panicked, we scrambled for flashlights, the wind howling outside as if mocking our fear. In the flashlight's beam, we saw it, a figure standing at the edge of the woods, barely visible. It was motionless, just watching us. We screamed and the figure vanished. We decided to leave at first light, no longer caring about the weekend getaway. The rest of the night was a blur of fear and paranoia. When dawn finally broke, we packed hurriedly and left, not looking back. On our drive back to Denver, we barely spoke, each lost in our thoughts about what we had seen. To this day, we don't know what was out there in the snowy wilderness. Was it a person, a creature, or just our imagination fueled by isolation and fear? The unanswered questions haunt us, but one thing is certain: the mountains hold secrets, and some are better left undiscovered. The mountains can hide many secrets, as our last story showed, but nothing compares to the chilling suspense of being lost in the wilderness. Stay tuned as this next story takes you on a harrowing journey of survival against the merciless winter. Third story by Marcus Green. It was December 2022 when I decided to embark on a solo hiking trip in the White Mountains of New Hampshire. As an experienced hiker, I felt confident in my ability to navigate the trails, even in winter. I was seeking solitude and a chance to clear my head, away from the bustle of Boston. The first day was exhilarating. The beauty of the snow-covered mountains was mesmerizing. I followed a well-marked trail, setting up camp as dusk approached. That night, the weather took a turn. A blizzard hit unexpectedly, reducing visibility to near zero. I huddled in my tent, hoping it would pass by morning. But when I awoke, the landscape had transformed. The trail markers were buried under snow, and the path was indistinguishable. Panic set in as I realized I was lost. My phone had no signal, and my GPS was malfunctioning due to the cold. For the next 2 days, I wandered aimlessly, trying to find my way back. The cold was relentless, and food supplies were dwindling. The nights were the worst, filled with the howling wind and the haunting feeling of utter isolation. On the third day, my situation grew desperate. I was weak, disoriented, and frostbitten. As I trudged through a particularly dense part of the forest, I heard something, a faint sound that wasn't the wind. It was a voice calling out. Following it, I stumbled upon a small cabin, smoke rising from its chimney. The cabin's occupant, an elderly hermit, took me in. He was a retired ranger who lived off-grid. He nursed me back to health, sharing his food and warmth. I learned that he had chosen this solitary life after a tragedy had taken his family years ago. His wisdom and resilience were inspiring. After the storm had passed and I had regained my strength, the hermit guided me back to civilization. He refused any reward, simply saying, "The mountains teach us humility." Returning home, I was a changed man. The experience had given me a new perspective on life, the fragility of our existence, and the unexpected kindness that can be found in the most desolate places. The White Mountains had tested me in ways I'd never imagined. I had faced the raw power of nature and survived, but not alone. The hermit's kindness had been my salvation, a reminder of the good in humanity amidst the vast, indifferent wilderness. That story of survival really tugs at the heartstrings, doesn't it? But the journey through our winter horrors isn't over yet. Our next tale brings us back to the eerie solitude of a mountain cabin. Get ready for a story that blurs the lines between reality and nightmare. Fourth story by Sarah Jennings. In the winter of 2023, I, Sarah Jennings, decided to spend a week alone in my family's cabin in the Blue Ridge Mountains of Virginia. It was a quaint, rustic place, perfect for some quiet writing and reflection. The nearest town was miles away, and the cabin was surrounded by dense woods. The first 2 days were peaceful, filled with writing and long walks in the snow. However, by the third night, things began to change. It started with small oddities, a misplaced book, a chair slightly moved, sounds of something scraping against the outside walls. I rationalized these as quirks of an old cabin settling in the cold. But then, the feeling of being watched crept over me. It was subtle at first, a prickling sensation on the back of my neck, a fleeting shadow from the corner of my eye. I tried to shake off the feeling, blaming it on the isolation and my overactive imagination. The turning point came on the fourth night. I woke to a sound downstairs, a soft thud, like something being gently set on the wooden floor. Heart pounding, I crept down the stairs. The living room was dimly lit by the dying fire. There, on the coffee table, was a mug that I had not used, steaming as if freshly filled with tea. I was frozen in shock. There was no logical explanation. The doors were locked, the windows sealed against the winter chill. The sense of an unseen presence was overwhelming. I searched the cabin, finding nothing amiss, but the sense of intrusion was undeniable. Sleep was elusive that night. The next morning, I found more signs of an unseen guest. A book open to a page I hadn't read. A blanket folded on the couch that I had left unfolded. The feeling of being watched intensified, and I felt a growing sense of dread. On the fifth night, the air in the cabin grew inexplicably cold. I heard whispers, unintelligible, as if carried by the wind through the cracks in the walls. Shadows seemed to move with a life of their own. I was terrified, feeling as if I was sharing the cabin with something unseen, something otherworldly. Unable to bear it any longer, I decided to leave the next morning. As I packed, the sun rose, casting light through the cabin. For a brief moment, the shadows and whispers seemed to dissipate, as if the presence had withdrawn, satisfied with having driven me away. To this day, I can't explain what happened in that cabin. Was it a ghost, a figment of my imagination, or something else? The experience left me with more questions than answers. The cabin still stands in the Blue Ridge Mountains, but I have never returned, nor do I plan to. Some mysteries are better left unsolved. Some presences better left undisturbed. Creepy, right? The thought of an unseen presence is always unsettling. But our final story might just top them all. We're taking you deep into a winter forest, where the line between reality and fear becomes dangerously thin. Fifth story by Alexander Thompson. It was the winter of 2024, and I, Alexander Thompson, was on a photography expedition in the dense forests of the Scottish Highlands. The goal was to capture the stark beauty of nature in winter. I had always been fascinated by the serene yet haunting landscapes that this season offered. My journey began in a small village where locals spoke of the forest with a mixture of respect and fear. They told tales of strange noises and sightings, but I dismissed these as superstitious. Armed with my camera and camping gear, I ventured into the forest. The first few days were uneventful, filled with the peaceful solitude that only nature can offer. The snow-covered trees and frozen streams made for stunning photographs. But as I ventured deeper into the forest, a sense of unease began to grow. One evening, as the light faded, I heard a strange sound, a soft, whispering voice coming from deeper in the woods. It was so faint, I thought I had imagined it, but then it came again, a wordless murmur, like a conversation just out of earshot. Curiosity overcame my unease, and I followed the sound. It seemed to move, always just a bit further away, leading me deeper into the forest. As the light faded, I realized I had strayed far from my camp and had lost my bearings. Night in the forest was a different world. The trees seemed to close in, and the sounds of the forest were more pronounced. The whispering continued, now seeming to come from multiple directions. It was disorienting, and fear began to take hold. I spent a restless night huddled near a tree, the cold seeping into my bones. The whispering continued intermittently, a chilling soundtrack to my fear. When dawn broke, I was exhausted and disoriented, but determined to find my way back. As I walked, I noticed strange markings on some trees, symbols that seemed deliberate but were unfamiliar to me. The whispering seemed to follow me, and I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. After what felt like hours, I finally emerged from the forest, far from where I had entered. The villagers were not surprised to see me shaken. They spoke of the spirits in the forest, protectors of the land who did not take kindly to intruders. I left the Scottish Highlands with more than just photographs. I left with a deep respect for the power and mysteries of nature. The experience in the forest was unexplainable, and the whispers remain a haunting memory. It was a reminder that some places on Earth are still beyond our understanding, where the line between the natural and the supernatural is blurred. Thank you for joining me on this chilling journey through winter's darkest tales. Each story brought us face to face with the unknown, reminding us of the thin veil between reality and fear. If you enjoy these stories, don't forget to check out the recommended video on the screen. It's one of my personal favorites. Stay safe, keep warm, and remember, some mysteries are best left in the shadows of winter. Farewell until our next eerie adventure.